So this here is one of the cameras that I use to photograph concerts all around the world. It is filled with features, but the settings, they can be incredibly complex. Of course, I'm talking all about the Canon EOS R3, and it's happening on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. If you've got a photo question, you know what to do by now. You just go to askdavidbergman.com and submit that form right there on the site. I just might pick your question and answer right here on a future show. Today's question was sent in by Al D, and he wants to know, what are your favorite settings on the Canon EOS R3 camera? So I could actually tell by the email address that the Al who sent that in, that's my old friend Al Diaz. We actually worked together at the Miami Herald way back in the day. He's still down there mostly covering sports for the paper, and he's using the R3 because it's a fantastic sports camera. You really can't beat this thing for build quality, speed, and the incredibly advanced autofocus system. This is really as good as it gets. But as I mentioned, and based on Al's questions, there are a lot of settings in the camera. It can get really confusing, and I know many photographers, even working pros, who still haven't quite got it completely set up exactly how they want. Now, I've been using two R3 bodies to cover concerts on the road for about a year and a half now, and I've got it tweaked just how I want it. See, I'm the guy that actually reads the manual cover to cover, because if the camera's not doing what I expect, I need to know how to fix it. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through some of the most important settings in the camera. Now, I don't usually do brand-specific videos on this channel, but I'm a Canon Explorer of Light, and I know this system really well. Some other brands have similar settings, so this could help even if you don't shoot Canon. Now, of course, this is just how I have it set up for photographing concerts, which is basically like fast action, very similar to covering sports. Of course, you should adjust for your own style of photography. With that said, let's get to it. Now, I'm hooked up here to an Atomos Ninja 5 field recorder so you can see my menus. That's the only reason I'm hooked up here, so I can record the menus and you can see what I'm doing. And I'm going to go through them here, kind of one menu group at a time, and you can get an idea what we're talking about. Now, first group here, these red menus here. Of course, I'm shooting RAW. That's pretty easy. I always shoot full aspect ratio. I'm not shooting 4:3 or 16:9 unless I have a very specific need to do that. Number two here, there's really nothing in here I'm really too concerned about. A lot of these things are really only affected when you're shooting JPEGs. So I'm shooting RAW, so that's really not going to be too much of an issue. On number three here, anti-flicker, I always have that on. That's kind of it's hit and miss a little bit. When I'm shooting, I did a video about banding that you sometimes get with LED lighting. Anti-flicker sometimes can help with that. It's a bit hit and miss. I feel like it only helps if you're really shooting straight on. And when I'm shooting concerts, it's always different angles, and we've got video walls and lighting, and there's other things you can do to actually help yourself with banding. Go ahead and watch that video. I give more details on that. That's really all I care about in there. I don't care about metering mode because I'm shooting manual exposure, so I don't really care what metering mode I am on. White balance, I'm always on auto white balance because, again, shooting RAW, I'm going to be setting that in post. There's no loss in quality by doing it that way, so I'm not going to worry about that too much. All of these other things, again, are not really affected in the RAW file. Even the color space, I do shoot in sRGB, but with the RAW file, it really doesn't matter. You can export pretty much whatever you want. If I want to export Adobe RGB, I can. To be truthful, I actually work pretty much all sRGB in my workflow because the reality is most people are looking at your images in sRGB. They're using their phone. If I'm making prints, all of that is sRGB, so I don't stress too much about having a wider color gamut on there. But if I do need to export from my RAW converter in Adobe RGB, I will do that. Next menu here, long exposure noise reduction, I don't have on unless I need it. If I'm doing astrophotography, star trail, something like that, you have to be careful with that because it will lock the camera up for the same amount of time as your exposure. So if you do a 2-minute long exposure, then it's going to lock up for 2 minutes after that. It's a great feature, but you need to know that that's happening. So I don't turn that on unless I actively need it. High ISO speed noise reduction, that is noise reduction in the camera for higher ISOs if you're shooting 6400, 12800. But again, the RAW file, that's not really affected, so I don't worry about it. I do have it on standard, but it doesn't really matter because I'm going to do any noise reduction I want to do after the fact in post. Next one, I don't do any of these. Multiple exposure, if you want to play around with that in camera. Focus bracketing. Panning assist is a cool feature, but it only works in electronic shutter, and you also have to turn anti-flicker off. I shoot mechanical shutter, which we'll get to in a second. So I don't really have that. If I really am shooting something where I'm worried about, I'm doing some panning shots and I want to try that out, it is a good function, but it only works in the electronic shutter. Drive mode, I am in mechanical shutter, so these numbers, here's a little tip for Canon. I wish they would put the actual frames per second on here instead of just calling it high-speed continuous plus, high-speed continuous, and low speed. It does get a little confusing, but if you're on the mechanical shutter like I am, these three settings are roughly 12 frames a second, 6 frames a second, and 3 frames a second. I usually shoot concerts at 6 frames a second. I don't need 12 frames a second when I'm shooting a concert. If I do, if I'm shooting sports, I will probably go to 12. If you switch to the electronic shutter, these actually change to 30, 15, and I think 3 or 6. I'm not sure what the low speed is if you're on the electronic shutter. I'm on mechanical shutter. I'm using 6 frames a second. That's high speed continuous. Of course, I'm not shooting single. This is that crazy custom high speed where you can get 195 frames a second, but only at 50 frames at a time. So if you want to shoot like a tennis racket right on the ball or a bat right on the ball, that's kind of cool. The challenge there is, then you have to switch back to normal shooting as soon as the ball, it gets in the air. So it's a little tricky. It's fun to play around with. I think that's a cool feature. As they make that more accessible, it's going to be really, really cool. The interval timer, that's an intervalometer. That's nice to have built in there if you need it. I've done time-lapse videos. Those are really cool. Obviously, you just turn that on when you need it, and then it's off the rest of the time. Silent shutter, I have off because I am shooting mechanical. If you turn it on, it switches you automatically to the electronic shutter, but I am shooting mechanical shutter, so I don't need that. If I want to shoot silent shutter for something, if I'm on a set of a movie set or shooting something in a courtroom or something like that where you really need to be quiet, I suppose wedding photographers right in the middle of a ceremony, if it's very quiet in the room, that's really nice to have that silent shutter. I don't use it, again, because I'm shooting mechanical shutter. Yes, I do shoot the mechanical shutter. I think the electronic shutter has some amazing advances. We're still kind of in the early days of good electronic shutters. This is a very good one, and for those kinds of uses for things, like I said, like silent shooting, and for if you want to shoot 30 frames a second, having that electronic option is really nice. I guess I'm just old school. I still like having a real mechanical shutter, flipping up and down there. So there are some advantages. I've done videos again about the differences there. So I'll put a link to that as well. And then release shutter without card. I always have that off. I have that disabled, that you cannot take a picture if there's not a card in the camera. I don't know why you ever would want to. That seems like a recipe for disaster. If you don't have a card in the camera and you can actually push the shutter button and it sounds like it's taking pictures, but it's actually not because there's no card in there, that would be a problem. So I have that off. That way I can't even push the button if that is if there's no card in there. You can push the button, it just won't do anything. Image stabilizer mode, that is because I have a lens on here right now. I have the 50mm that is not, and it does not have image stabilization on that lens. So this option is available to me. This is in-body image stabilization. You can turn that on or off. If you are using a lens that has image stabilization on it, then this option is controlled only by the button on the lens. The lens has that image stabilization on and off. If you turn it on, then it activates both the lens and the body image stabilization together. You can't separate those two. I don't know why you would ever want to. So it's both on or both off, and based only on that button. So this option will go away if you were using one of those lenses. Still photo IS, all that means is, will the image stabilization be on sort of all the time or just when you take the picture? I prefer it only when you take the picture because there's a little bit of jiggle that happens. The gimbal in there moves around. And when you're not quite taking the picture yet, having that movement I think is a little jarring. It may be a little smoother. I don't know. I haven't tested it. If you have that on all the time, I'm fine with this only for shot, which means when you take the picture, that image stabilization kicks in while you're taking the picture, and that's really all you need it for anyway. Let's see. Anything else on here that's important? I don't use the touch shutter. That's basically the back screen if you want to touch the screen and have it take a picture. I don't really use that touch screen when I'm shooting because I don't want to hit it by accident. I'm fine hitting the shutter button with myself. Image review, of course, is off. I don't want pictures popping up there every time after I take a photo. This high-speed display, I haven't noticed too much of a difference. It's a little bit, I think it's the, it's 120 hertz instead of 60 if you have it enabled. Probably eats a little more battery, but I have it on. It looks fine. Looks great as it is. Metering timer, just as how long the meter stays on. Then display simulation, I have that exposure and depth of field. That means I'm seeing through the viewfinder. I'm seeing what the exposure will look like, what the image will look like when I take the picture, including the depth of field. So it actually stops down the lens. So you're seeing that an approximation of what your picture is going to look like as you're shooting. If you disable that, basically it's just going to give you sort of an average view when you're looking through, but it's not going to be actually what your settings are, your shutter speed, your aperture, your ISO. You're not going to see the brightness level of that if you have that disabled. I do have this in my quick menu, you'll see later, because if I do want to disable it, if I'm shooting with strobes in the studio, I will disable that because I'm going to be in a dark room and the strobe will go off, and that's the exposure I care about, but I'm not seeing that when I'm preparing to shoot, only when the picture is taken. So I use exposure and depth of field. I don't really know why you would want it just exposure without seeing the depth of field. I don't think there's any harm in having that depth of field on. This OVF simulation, that's actually pretty cool. Basically what it does, it's kind of for us old school photographers, it changes the view, the simulation view, where it looks more like you're looking through an optical viewfinder. And it changes the color a little bit. I don't know what other kind of magic it's doing there. It's a little more high def, I guess. And it looks much more natural, but you don't get the exposure simulation. So you're not seeing, it doesn't look like how your picture is going to actually look when you take the picture. So as cool as that feature is, I don't use it because I want to see exactly what my picture is going to look like. I'm judging my exposure. I work in a lot of fast changing light conditions. So I want to see that exact exposure because as the light is changing at a concert, I'm dialing my shutter speed to change my brightness level. And so I want to see how that is impacting my photo. If I'm shooting something, I guess, where the exposure wasn't changing much, and I just wanted to pretend like I'm shooting an old optical viewfinder, I guess I would turn that on, but honestly, I don't use it. Shooting info display, VF display format, these are basically just what you're seeing on screen. You can change the different options you're seeing on the viewfinder. If it's really important to you what's there, that's great. Knock yourself out. You can adjust those all you want. I don't mess with that too much. Now, the autofocus settings. This is where a lot of people get messed up. I'm on servo 100% of the time. I don't shoot one shot. I'm using back button focus, so I want to be on servo with that. I want my focus motors to be moving constantly with action. I want them to be keeping up with my subject. I'm using back button to focus, and then when I take a picture with my shutter button, that's separate from my back button focus. So I'm on servo all the time. AF area, that's just, you can set it differently if you want. When you switch to vertical orientation, you can have a small point when you're vertical and then a larger point or a zone when you're on horizontal or vertical. You can switch that off. Now, subject tracking I have on. This is one of the best things about the R3, the subject tracking mode. Basically, it will pick up your subject and it will track that subject. I want to subject track almost all the time, usually on an eye or on a face. There are times when I don't want to, and I address that in the custom settings that's coming up a little bit later, so stay tuned for that. But my default setting is to have subject tracking on. Subject to detect is people. That's what I photograph, so I'm going to do that. If you're somebody who does a lot of animals or cars or something like that, you can turn that, switch over to that. Eye detection I want on. I want it to pick up the eye whenever possible. Switching track subjects, I leave it on 0. Basically, doesn't really matter to me that much because I'm going to switch. That's if you have multiple people and it's how fast it switches from one person to the other. I'm doing that using the back button focus. I'm recomposing. I'm selecting the person that I want to focus on. So I don't really care so much about this setting. I'll talk more about that when we get to the custom settings, custom buttons. The case modes, a lot of debate in the photo world, in the Canon world, I should say, especially in sports, about the cases. People get very hung up on these. I don't stress about it that much. I'm shooting auto. That's a new setting on the R3, which is really nice. Basically what these are presets of those two settings down at the bottom, the tracking sensitivity and the acceleration deceleration tracking. Each one of these modes, 1, 2, 3, 4, is a different combination of those two settings. There's no magic there. It's just presets of those two settings. You could go in and manually change those as you want. Basically, if you shoot something where that's going to be important to you, then you should pick the case that's best for you. Tracking sensitivity is how, again, it's sort of how fast it will switch. If somebody runs in front, you're focused on somebody, let's say a basketball player, and the referee runs in front between you and that player, how fast it will switch when it's tracking, or if it will stay locked on that person. And then acceleration, deceleration, tracking is if you're shooting something that moves sort of unpredictably back and forth, left and right, forward and back, as opposed to if you're photographing car racing, for example, where it's the same motion over and over and it's consistent. It's a consistent speed. You can actually set the camera to lower the sensitivity there, so it will guesstimate the focus much better if it knows something's moving the same speed. So I'm on auto. I think that's worked fine for me. I can't say I've had an issue with things being out of focus with this camera, so I'm really not too worried about it. Then we get into menu 3 here. One shot, AF release prior. Now remember, I don't shoot one shot, so this isn't really important to me. If you do, I have this on all the way on focus. You can put it on release or focus. Basically what that means, if you're on one shot and your priority is for focus, that means when you push down the button, it's going to make sure your subject is in focus before it takes the picture. So there may be a little bit of a delay. If it's having trouble finding focus, it might be, even if it's a millisecond, you will feel that delay. If you put this over on release, then what that's going to do is that as soon as you push the button, as soon as you release the shutter button, actually pushing down, I don't know why it's called release, but when you're pushing down the shutter button, it's going to fire right away, even if it's not in focus. So if I'm using one shot, which I'm not, if I was, I would want the picture to be in focus, my subject to be in focus. So this is, for me, is always on focus. On here, otherwise, this is sort of a manual focus thing. Lens drive when AF impossible. If it's not finding focus, do you want the lens to keep hunting, or do you want it just to sort of stop doing that? I have it continue, so it's just going to keep trying. That almost never happens, but if it does, that's an issue. And then the AF assist beam, I have it on so the LED will fire either on the, if there's one on the flash or on the camera if it needs it. I don't use that focus assist beam really ever. I probably could turn that off, but I just have that on that default as my default. Limit AF areas. So that's when you're selecting the different autofocus types you want to use. You can limit the ones. I don't use the tiny little spot. I use the 1 point there. I don't really use, there's these two expanded AF areas. They're very similar. You can almost, I bet nobody can tell the difference between these two. One of them gives you the corners just as kind of a little bit of a hook to hold onto your subject. This one does. This one doesn't. I don't find much of a difference. I don't use this one. I use this one. These zones I don't use, and I have the whole area AF just available to me if I need it. Of course, you can activate these if you want to go back in here, but if I'm switching through these, I don't want to have to go through 7 or 8 different modes before I get to the one I want. This way I only have 3 active, so it's just for speed. Honestly, I don't switch very often, so not too much of an issue. AF area selection control, that's if you want to change your autofocus points, where that is, how you do it. I have this set so you push the button, the AF point selection button, and then you can move it around with the main dial, which is the dial on the back. You could have it so it's the multi-function button on the top. I use that for something else, so I don't have that on. This is the sensitivity of the joystick. When you're moving your AF points around, how fast it moves, basically. I have it on the default. And orientation linked AF point, I like that. That's if you turn vertically, do you want the focus point to stay where it was when you were horizontal, or do you want a different orientation? I prefer it to be different, so I usually have my focus point about 1/3 of the way down. So like right there, that's my sort of default place. And if I go vertical, it's going to change like that because that's now 1/3 of the way down on the vertical orientation. But I like that. You can have it set so that it stays in the same place if you want to, but I don't want that. So that's how I'm set there. Number 5, manual focus peaking settings. If you shoot manual focus, you can bring up things like, it brings up those peaking, so it's like a little red, or you can have any color, a few different colors, so you can see focus a little bit better. Again, I don't manual focus, so not much of an issue. Focus guide, same thing. If you're on manual focus, it gives you these little points that move back and forth, so it's going to help you to manual focus. Register people priority, I just started playing around with. You can actually register a person. You can either take a picture of them or you can load in a photo from that's already on your card of a person, and it will sort of give priority to that person when you're focusing. I haven't A/B tested this with it on and off to really see how much of a difference it makes. I am on tour now with Luke Combs. I did use a picture of Luke. I put him in there. Most of the time, if he's in the frame, I'm going to want to focus on him. So I have that set up in there. Is it making a difference? I don't know. I'm not really sure. But it's a cool function. I'm sure that's only going to get better. And then number 6 here, these are manual focus settings. I don't shoot manual focus, so not really an issue. Basically, if you can switch, if you're shooting autofocus and you want to be able to switch to manual focus, how that process works, if you just can dial the focus ring, if that's going to happen right away, or if it's going to lock or not. That's kind of what these settings are. You can change the ring rotation direction if you want, which is kind of cool. If you're coming from another system, I know Nikon, the dial goes the other way, the focus ring. So if you've been shooting Nikon and you've switched to Canon, then you can, and you want to, in your manual focusing, you want to leave that same direction. If your muscle memory is like that, that's kind of nice to have that. Then these blue menus, I really don't go in these blue menus at all. The only time I can remember doing that is one time. The blue menu is basically internal raw processing, like camera image processing. That's what a lot of those are. One time I did shoot something on an old camera. I think it was the 5D Mark III. Am I saying that right? Yeah, the 5D Mark III. And I hadn't shot that camera in a while. I was shooting newer cameras and I used that as a remote. And I believe that camera takes CF cards and SD cards. And I was shooting the CF, which is what I used for so long. I have so many old CF cards, and I was on the road and I realized I didn't have a CF reader with me and I couldn't get those images off there. I didn't have the right USB cable for that camera. I thought I was going to be in trouble. And then I remembered, since there's 2 slots in there, I put an SD card and I actually copied all the images from the CF to the SD, which was kind of cool that I could just do that internally. And then I could read that SD card in my computer. So that's really the only time I can remember going in there. I really don't touch these at all. The network settings, oh boy, I'm not getting into those. Those are very complicated. If you're an IT person and you need, like if you're working for a big wire service and you're covering the Super Bowl, they have an IT person to set this up. These things there's a lot of settings in here. And if you need them, then you know what they are and you know how to set them up. But I don't do any of this kind of stuff. I'm not, there is Wi-Fi in here, so you can send images. You can, it is very simple just to go right to your phone. You use the Canon Camera Connect app. That's simple to set up, but these can get really complex. So like I said, you probably know what you're doing with those if you're setting them up. The yellow menus, let's see, obviously format card is important. That's in there. Let's see, what else do we have here? This stuff I'm not changing. English, of course, because that's what I speak. Viewfinder brightness. This is important here. So screen viewfinder display. I have that by default. It's on switching, where it's either going to be only on the screen or it's going to switch. Pretty sure the default is so that the viewfinder on the back, the screen on the back is on. And then when you pick the camera up to your eye, it actually turns off that screen and switches to the electronic viewfinder. That's cool, but I don't like that back screen to be on unless I want it on. I don't want other people seeing it. If I'm in a dark place, it's going to lighten up the room. I don't want that thing on until I want it. So what I do is I have it set. It really doesn't matter which one I have this set on, and I'm going to manually switch it when I want to. And I'll get to that when I talk about my customized buttons. But I have it on screen by default. It's not going to switch automatically. That's the main thing to know there. Of course, you can change the brightness. I don't really want to do that. I want that in the middle because I want it consistent. I don't want it too bright or too dark. That's just, it's going to mess me up if it looks brighter than I think it is. I guess if you're in a really dark environment and the screen is super bright, you can darken it down, but I like to have it consistent wherever I am. Eye control, here's the thing about eye control. It's a very cool function. Eye control is brand new with this camera, with the R3, and what you're looking at is what it focuses on. So that's how you choose. If you have multiple people in your picture, the one that you're looking at, it actually can see where your eye is looking and will focus on that person. The challenge with that is it's first generation technology and it doesn't work really well with glasses or with contact lenses. I wear progressive lenses, and so that really messes it up because what's in focus is different depending on where I look through my glasses with progressives. So you have to set this up, this eye control, you have to calibrate it a number of times. The more you do it, the better it gets. And you also do it in different lighting conditions, and it's cool tech, and it's gonna get there. It's not quite there yet because it's not consistent for everybody's eyes. So when it is, it's gonna be awesome. But right now, I don't use it. It's an extra function that doesn't hurt me in any way by not using it. But I'm not quite there yet because I wear glasses. I guess if I didn't wear glasses, I would definitely set that up, especially in the concert environment where that's the same lighting conditions over and over. But for me, I'm not using it at this point. Touch control, I don't worry about. Multifunction lock, this one's important. On the back of the camera, the on-off switch in the middle has a lock position. And when it's on lock, that's where I put it naturally when I'm shooting. This basically tells the camera which functions to lock, which dials to lock. Basically, when I put the camera down at my side, I don't want it to bump my leg or something and have it change my settings. And when I pick it up, it's going to be all out of whack, right? All of my exposure is going to be way off. So by putting it in lock, when I put it down, I actually turn it off when I put it down. But when I'm shooting, I have it locked, so I don't even bump it with any other finger or anything. So this basically says which functions to lock. So in my case, I leave the main dial open because that's what I'm using. That's my shutter speed. That's what I'm using to change my exposure. But my quick control dial 2, which is right around the mode dial, that's locked. That's my aperture. I don't want that to change. And the quick control dial 1, that is the actual dial on the back. I don't want to bump that and have that changed. My joystick, the multi-controller, as they call it, I leave that open. If I do want to move my focus point around, I really don't. So, but if I push down on that focus point, on that joystick, the multi-controller, it actually moves the focus point back to my registered location. So I'll get to that in a little bit, but that's a cool function. So I want to have that available when, even if the camera's locked, because if I do move the point by accident, I can just push down on that and it's going to go back to the registered point. Touch control, I already have off anyway, so that's not an issue. Smart controller, I also have off. I don't use that smart controller. I'll talk about that in a minute. The control ring will be locked. So that's kind of nice that stuff all gets locked. What else? Let's see. Reset camera, firmware. The latest firmware is 1.4.1. I've got that up to date. In here in the orange menus, most of these are, let's see, these look like all defaults. Thirds of a stop I can set. So when I go from 5.6 to f8, it takes me in thirds of a stop. That is the default. You could put it at halves if you want. That's less control. So I want to have thirds of a stop so I can control it a little more in between stops. Let's see. Everything else in here is default. Here, okay. This is a great one. I have to thank my friend Brett Carlson for teaching me this one. Thank you, Brett. Same exposure for new aperture. Okay. This is kind of a big one, and this is going to change the way I shoot. I've just learned about this thanks to Brett, and I am changing it. I changed it yesterday. I'm going to be using it as soon as the next concert I shoot, which is in a few days. So here's what this does. The way I shoot, I'm changing my exposure constantly. And if you've come to one of my workshops or you've watched some of my videos about this, what I do is I lock down 2 of my 3 exposure settings. I'm shooting manual, but in the case of a concert, I lock down my aperture and my shutter speed, and I only leave my aperture and my ISO, and I only leave my shutter speed to change my brightness, the exposure of my image. So that's how I can do it quickly when there's fast changing light conditions. But here's the challenge. When I'm using a lens with a variable aperture, so I use the RF 100-500 as my long lens, that is a variable aperture. So at 100 millimeters, you can open up to 4.5, but as you zoom in, that closes down, and by the time you get to 500 millimeters, it's at 7.1. That's the maximum aperture at 500 millimeters. So what I've always done, and what I teach in my workshops, if you have a variable aperture lens, is just set it at 7.1 and just in your brain, that's just a 7.1 lens. Even though at 100 you could open up, what is that, 7.1 to 4.5? That's stop and a third, I think, something like that. Somewhere around, let's say 7.1, 2 stops to 5.6, 4.5, that's 1 stop, right? Okay, anyway, don't correct me, but something like that if I'm wrong. Somewhere around that, it changes the exposure. And I don't want that to happen as I'm zooming. So I just lock it at 7.1 and I forget about it. I set it and I forget it. What this setting does, same exposure for new aperture. So now by setting this on ISO, what that does is if I'm at 7.1 at 500 millimeters, as I zoom out, my aperture is going to open up, right? So 7.1 to 6.3 to 5.6 to 4.5. Yeah, it's 1 stop difference. I calculated that, right? As I go from 7.1, as that aperture opens up, if my ISO didn't change, if nothing else changed, my image would get brighter and brighter because my aperture is opening up. What this does is it compensates. I'm telling it to compensate with ISO. So it's going to actually change my ISO. If I'm brightening up with my aperture, it's going to darken with my ISO the same amount. So my exposure value, my EV, the brightness of my image isn't going to change. So as I go, let's say I'm at 6400 ISO at 7.1. As it goes to 6.3, it's going to go 1/3 of a stop down from 6400. What is that, 5,000? Something like that. Then at 4.5, it's going to go to 4,000, whatever the number is in there. And then at 7.1, 6.3, 5.6, all the way to 4.5. So at 4.5, it's going to be at 3,200. I hope I'm calculating that correctly. I'm thinking on my feet here, folks. But anyway, point is, it's going to adjust my ISO as my aperture opens up to keep the same brightness. That's insane. That's a super cool setting. Whoever thought of that should be commended for that. Whatever engineer came up with that. I'm sure it was a photographer who said, is there a way to do this? And the engineer said, sure, we'll make it happen. So thank you, Canon, for doing that. That's very cool. This setting, you can if you disable it, it's going to work just like normal, where it's not going to change anything. You set it on ISO, it's going to change your ISO as you zoom, as your aperture change. This also works, by the way, with teleconverters. So if you put a 1.4 on if you have a lens that takes a teleconverter and you put a 1.4, you lose a stop of light. So your aperture closes down 1 stop automatically. You normally would have to change either your shutter speed or your ISO to adjust for that exposure drop, right? That loss of a stop. But now this will do it automatically. So if you drop from 5.6 to 4, that opens up your aperture 1 stop. It's going to darken your ISO 1 stop. So that's awesome. You can have it change your ISO and your shutter speed, just your shutter speed. I'd rather have it change ISO. I'm setting my shutter speed. My aperture is going to do what it does as I zoom, and that's going to change my ISO. Super cool. Thank you, Brett, for pointing that one out. That's a very cool function. Otherwise on here, I restrict shooting modes. These are just if you're changing modes, you hit the mode button, then you want to change. These are ones that you won't even see, options you won't even see. I don't use FV. I don't use program. I really don't use anything besides manual. But if I want to change, at least I have these other options available to me. Of course, you can always add them back if you need them, but I don't really use them. So it's just for speed. You don't have to cycle around through 8 or 9 settings. You can just do the 2 or 3 that you need. So that's kind of nice. Everything else looks pretty much normal on here. Micro adjustment, I don't touch. Restrict drive modes, I don't touch. These are directions if you want to switch which dial does your aperture, which dial does your shutter speed. I haven't changed those. Customized buttons we're going to get to in a second. That's a big one. Customized dials is basically, it's exactly that. It's which dial has which settings. So in this case, I have my shutter speed, which is TV, on my main dial. I have my aperture on my quick control dial, which is right around the mode button. And then I have the dial on the back, I have that off. I don't really use that for anything. I don't want to bump that, even though it does get locked anyway. I don't use it for anything. If I want to change my ISO, I use this here. That's the control ring on the lens. That is all the RF lenses, the newer RF lenses have the focus dial, and they have a zoom ring if it's a zoom lens, and they have the third dial that's the control ring. You also, some of the adapters, you can buy the adapter if you're using older EF lenses. I have the adapter that has the control ring on it. So it gives you another point of control, another button you can use basically. So that dial, I have that set to change my ISO. The cool thing about it is too, I have it so you have to hold the shutter button down halfway. and then dial that control ring. So that's how I change my ISO. I also have another button programmed for it as well as a backup, but that's how I normally do it. It's nice that you have to push it halfway so you don't bump it by accident. All right, customized buttons. This is a big one. This is where a lot of people, I can't preach enough about the importance of customizing your buttons for your style of shooting. It's huge. Everybody's going to be a little bit different, but let me show you what I do. So this first one here is the shutter button. By default, it's on metering and AF start, I believe. I don't even know what that first one is. This is, when you're using eye control, I don't use that. Forever, it was metering and AF start. I don't use AF start on there. I use back button focus. I probably could do a whole separate video about back button focus. I did a 2-minute tip video years ago. It's not a very good one, so because it was only 2 minutes. I think I'm going to do a longer video about that someday. I've had people ask me about it. But I have the shutter button is not focus and metering, just metering. So I've removed the focus function from my shutter button. It just takes the picture. Metering, all that means is the meter comes on inside the viewfinder. I'm shooting manual. I don't care what the meter says. I'm ignoring it. There's no way to turn that off. So that's what my shutter button does. It just takes the picture. The movie shooting button, I have that on the default. If I want to shoot video, that's the way to do it. I don't shoot video on this camera. Rarely. I will sometimes if I need a second or third body here in the studio for Ask David Bergman, but not too often. Usually I'm shooting stills with this camera. The multifunction button, that is the little button next to the main dial. That is how I switch from the viewfinder to the screen. So when I'm shooting, I usually am looking through the viewfinder. So that's the screen I have on, the viewfinder screen. If then I want to look at a picture, if I want to play back a photo, all I do is I hit that multifunction button and it will switch from the viewfinder to the screen. I can look at the picture real quick, then I hit that button again, that back screen turns off, and it only is in the viewfinder inside that electronic viewfinder. So I will not see that back screen. I don't want that back screen on all the time. I just don't, like I said earlier, I don't like when it switches back and forth automatically. I want to choose when to turn it on, when to turn it off. So that's how I do it. I use that little multifunction button, and it's very convenient. Then the multifunction 2 button, that's the top button on the side there. I have that set for my AF point selection. If I want to change where my AF point is, that's the button I push. Then I use the joystick, the multi-controller they call it, to move it around. Again, I don't do that. I leave it right there. That's where I want it. And I am not going to mess with that thing. I'm going to just leave it right there. And I'm going to aim my camera at whatever I want to shoot. So that's how I'm going to do that. Then I use let's see, what's next here? The light, the little button with the light on it, I use that to illuminate that little screen on the top. The default, I believe, is this one where it's short press and long press, and you get that info switching. I don't use info switching. I have it just on the LCD panel illumination. That's the light. So that's how I turn on that light. I just push down on that button. Really convenient to do that. The mode dial is the mode dial. I haven't messed with that. That's how I change the mode. Now, AF on. That AF on button is my metering and AF start. That is how I back button focus. So I want that on AF start at all times. Now, the way that works is that's going to, by default, be however you have the camera set up. So I have it set for subject tracking, and I have it on eye detection. And so basically that AF on button is my eye autofocus button. So it's going to look for a person, and that's how it's going to work, right? It's subject tracking, whatever I've told it to look for. That's what it's going to find, because that's how I have it set in these early menus back at the beginning. If you remember when we first started this, right back here in my autofocus, I have that set on subject tracking on. So when I use that for the AF on button, let's get back over here. When I use the AF on button here, that is how it's going to work. Now, I'll explain why I do it that way in a second. The smart controller is on that AF on button. There's a little optical sensor, and you can actually use that to move your focus point if you want. It's actually sees where your finger is, and you can slide back and forth on it. The 1DX Mark III had the same thing. It's a cool function. I don't use it. I don't move my AF points around. So I don't move it. I have it off. That way I don't move anything by accident. I don't want it to move. If I want to move my focus point, I'm just going to move the camera. right? That's much easier, much faster for me. I can react so much faster that way. Then the star button, this is the key. I did a video a couple years ago that I'll put a link to. This genuinely, like no hyperbole, was a game changer for me. Because if I'm photographing somebody, let's say a guitar player, and I'm on his face, I've got his whole body, I'm using my AF on point, it picks up his eye, picks up his face, subject tracking, it's gonna stay locked on him wherever he moves around, he or she. That's awesome. But then I pan down and zoom in on his hands or her hands just playing guitar. Well, if I'm on subject tracking for people and for eye detection, I don't know what it's going to focus on. I've now lost all control. So that was a problem for me if you're using that eye autofocus. So now what I have for this star button, I also have it on metering and AF start. So it is a traditional back button focus button. However, there's another little thing in here. When you have it set here, it says info detail set, which means you hit the info button and it brings up a whole bunch of other things that most people don't realize is there. So what this does is anything that you have checked, if you have it actively checked, you can turn it on and off. It's going to apply these settings. So if it's not checked, then it doesn't matter what this is set on. But the ones that checked, when you're pushing down the star button in this case, it's going to use these settings. It's not a toggle like it turns it on and off. It just uses these settings while you're pushing down that button. So AF operation is always going to be on servo. That's where I have it anyway. So I probably don't have to activate that, but that's just to be safe. AF area is that same little expanded AF area, right? But subject tracking, here's the key, is off. Okay, so I don't want it to track a subject. If I'm using that star button, it's my traditional old school AF autofocus point, the expanded AF area, and it's not going to move. It's just going to be at one spot, in that one spot. So the old focus and recompose technique, or if you just put it on your subject, that's what that button is. So now when I zoom in and pan down on the guitar player's hands, I can put the focus point right where I want it, right? By either moving the camera. You could move the focus point around if you want. I prefer to just move the camera. It's easier for me. So subject tracking off there. Anything else in here doesn't really matter. That's the main thing, is having subject tracking off. So now just those two buttons, that's a game changer. That allows you to switch very quickly from eye autofocus, subject tracking, to non-subject tracking, just regular servo autofocus. That's a game changer for me. Then the AF point selection button, that third button next to it, I don't use that since I don't move my AF points around. What I use that button for is register recall. I did a video about that recently. It's another cool function. What I have it set for, I've been playing around just a little bit with it. I don't use it often, but basically you can register a whole bunch of settings. You hit the info button again, and you can register a whole bunch of settings. And again, while you're pressing that button down, those settings will be active. When you let go, it goes back to however you had the camera set. So in this case, what I've been doing is I have it on TV, which is shutter priority, and I have my shutter at 1/4 of a second. That's obviously a very slow shutter speed. And then I have my ISO speed on auto ISO. So it's going to adjust, it's going to pick my exposure, which I don't normally do, but just to play around with this, it's kind of fun. If I'm shooting a concert and I want to do some 1/4 of a second panning shots or some zooms or just some blurry sort of funky kind of pictures, I can play around with that simply by moving my thumb over to that button, which is right there next to the star button. I don't have to like stop, change all my settings, and miss potential things that are happening. I'm shooting my regular way of shooting, fast shutter speeds, all of that kind of stuff, high ISO, and then I can just simply, oh, this second I want to try that picture. Just push on that button. I also have exposure compensation down 2/3 because in a concert, usually the subject is very bright and the background might be dark. So that way, it's just going to darken it down a little bit. It's a guess. Sometimes it's going to be over. Sometimes it's going to be under. I'm just playing around with it just to see. And then I have subject tracking on. Of course, I want to detect people. Eye detection is on. And then AF operation is on. So that means it is my traditional autofocus, back button autofocus. It's still going to continue to focus even though I'm not pushing my normal AF on button or the star button. I can have AF on. So that's a pretty cool function just to play around with. If you have some particular settings you need to switch back and forth to, it's a great way to go. I have my depth of field preview button set for ISO. Again, I normally change ISO by half button pressing and changing the control ring on the lens. But if I want to go ahead and push that lower button right there, that brings up the ISO really quickly. It's an easy way to go. I don't really use those buttons too often that are next to the lens there. They're kind of in an odd place and it's not, just doesn't feel natural to get in there. So I don't worry about it too much, but It's nice to have it there. The lens function button is on the long lenses, those big telephotos, the 400 2A, the 600 f4. Those big lenses have a button on the side that you can push. I don't use those lenses anymore. I still have them, but I don't really use them. I have it set for drive mode. I guess if you wanted to change different frames per second, shoot particularly fast, you could maybe shoot 30 frames a second just by pushing that button. That might be nice. That's how I imagine I would use it if I was doing it. The set button is in the middle of that dial on the back. That I have it for magnification. So if I'm playing back images, I'm looking at the pictures that I've already shot, and I want to zoom in and check focus or look at the expression or something like that, I can do that. That's kind of nice. And then the multi-controller, basically, that is how I move my focus point around if I was going to do that. So I have it set direct AF point selection. That means just if I move that multi-controller, the joystick, it's going to move my focus points around. So that's the big stuff on there. Again, smart controller I have off, so I don't want to use that optical sensor on the back. What else is in here? Anything else that's important? Audio compression is off. I want to have, if I'm recording audio into the camera, I don't want any compression. Why not? Might as well record the full quality on that. AV setting without lens just means that I can see the aperture number on the screen, even when there's no lens on there. Usually when you have the lens off, it just has dashes or says 0 or something like that. This will allow me to see the aperture. I don't know, it's not a big deal. Release shutter without lens. I can push the shutter button even if there's no lens on there. Of course, it's not going to be much of a picture, but but at least the shutter will still be active. Anything else on here? Not really. And then at the end here is my custom menus. So you can put whatever settings you use the most in here. So they're easily accessible all in one screen. You can have multiple screens. I don't know how many you can have, but you can have at least 2 or 3, probably a lot more than that. But I just have one set up here with my most important things that I use, things that I want to that I want to access the most often. Format card I use every time. Once I've backed up all my images, I'm on a new shoot. I want to start with a fresh card. I will format it. I can check my battery level. If I want to change customize my buttons, that is something sometimes if I use a camera as a remote, sometimes I might want to have the focus on the shutter because I'm going to be triggering it remotely. So that's really the only time I would change that. But it's if I do need to change it, or if I'm handing my camera to somebody, I want to turn off back button focus or change the focus area, I can do that pretty quickly. Like I can remove the back button focus there pretty quickly that way. Shutter mode, if I wanted to shoot 30 frames a second and go to electronic shutter, I can activate it here. I can access it here, excuse me. And display simulation, again, if I want to turn that off, if I'm in the studio, that's an easy way to access that. And that's really all I have in there. So it really is complex, but once you sort of wrap your brain around it, that's how all this works. I really hope that helps. That's how I have my R3 set up. I have 2 of them. The best thing is you can copy the settings from one to the other. So once I have one camera set up, you save the little file to the card. You take that card out, you put it in the other camera, and then you can load all of those settings, everything saved. I actually have that file saved also on my computer. If for whatever reason I updated the firmware and I lost all my settings or something happened, I had to send in for repair and I lost all my settings, I have my current settings saved in a folder in my computer. I can load that onto a card and access it anytime, and boom, I'm ready to go. So Al, I hope that helps. I know you're shooting these R3s. Who else out there is shooting with the R3? If you are, great, let me know if your settings match with mine or if you're doing something differently. Some other high-end Canon models do have some similar settings, so there may be some crossover there as well. Maybe you set it up differently than me. I'm really curious what you guys do out there and why. Let me know down in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going down there. Remember, if you have your own photo questions, of course, you can send them in by going to askdavidbergman.com and filling out that form. If you're not already a subscriber to the Adorama YouTube channel, go ahead and click that subscribe button down below. Hit the little bell icon. You'll be notified as soon as new shows come out from myself and all the other photo hosts right here on Adorama TV. Thank you so much for sitting through this with me. I really appreciate it. Hope it helps. Come back next time. I'll have a brand new question to answer right here on Ask David Bergman.